Welcome to another episode of Erik Wait Whiskey Studies, and in this video I'm going to do something a little different. I'm going to do an exploration of 10 whiskeys from around the world. So, in case you're new to my channel, I'm a certified sommelier with a quarter master sommeliers. If you're going to be a sommelier, while you may have a specialty in a particular region, I'm a French wine scholar with the Wine Scholar Guild, and I have a particular focus on Bordeaux. And of course, I live here in California, so I also have a huge background in California. But if you're going to be a sommelier, you need a well-rounded understanding of wines. So I've studied wines from France, Spain, Italy, Hungary, Germany, Austria, Greece, New World such as the United States, Canada, South Africa, South America, Argentina, Chile, New Zealand, Australia, and the list goes on and on. So I have a specialty in French wines, specifically Bordeaux wines and California. Same thing it goes with whiskeys. If you're going to be a student of whiskey, if you're going to call yourself, say, even a whiskey sommelier, you need to have a well-rounded understanding of whiskeys, even though you have a particular preference for, say, bourbons or Scotch whiskey. I'm a big Scotch whiskey fan. So in this video, I want to share with you 10 representatives of major whiskey regions around the world. Now, the big whiskey regions around the world, Ireland, Scotland, the United States, Canada, and Japan. But then there are also those sort of other world regions, such as Taiwan, other European nations, India, and so forth. So I'm going to share with you 10 whiskeys from these various regions. And our first stop is in Ireland, the birthplace of whiskey. There's a little debate between Scotland and Ireland as to who invented whiskey. It's generally said that the Irish invented it, but the Scots perfected it, but I'm going to leave that argument debate right there. If you're going to understand Irish whiskey, you got to do a pot still, an Irish pot still whiskey. It is sort of the namesake of Ireland, just as bourbon is with the United States. So this is a Powers Lane 12-year-old. But before I get into this, here are my notes. Powers John's Lane Pot Still Irish Whiskey from Middleton Distillery. It is triple distilled, aged 12 years in bourbon and sherry cask. It is bottled at 46% alcohol by volume and sells for around 59.5 pounds or $65 in my neighborhood. Now, of course, there are other pot still Irish whiskeys, such as Redbreast, and a lot of other distilleries do them as well. I wanted to share with you Powers Lane because most people are going to sort of go to Redbreast, and I really like Redbreast, but I like this one more because it has more of a sherry influence. This has sort of that 50-50 influence between bourbon cask and sherry cask, so it's not heavily sherry, it's not heavily bourbon, but that's sort of a nice medium level. Get orange, Christmas cake, vanilla, more like dried oranges, a little bit of fudge, dried black fruit notes, a little bit of fig, a little bit of raisins, real nice spice, say some cinnamon, clove, nutmeg on the palate. One of the things I like about pot still is, because you're using unmalted barley, is it gives it a silkier, creamier texture. So if you're not into whiskeys that sort of have a strong bite, this has that nice, soft, round mouthfeel that can remind you a little bit of a blended whiskey. So if you're tasting this blind, you might think this was, based on texture, you might think this had some grain whiskey in it. The beginning of this starts with some dried black fruit notes. It's somewhat sweet. Spice kicks in about the middle. A nice dried orange character, that Christmas cake character, raisins, figs, dates. That's a nice, fairly long finish, but it finishes with some spice. Now, ABV isn't real high on this one, and yet I think the flavor is maintained. This is a nice, well-rounded, easy drinking, very approachable Irish whiskey. So I want to highly recommend it. What would I give them in terms of score? I'll go like a solid 88 points. All right, so my second whiskey, another Irish whiskey, is the Teeling Black Pit's single malt whiskey. One have two representatives from Ireland, one of the traditional Irish, but also, we forget that Irish whiskeys also come in single malts. Scotland's not the only place that's doing single malts, nor are they the first. Ireland was doing single malt before Scotland. However, they say Scotland perfected it. Now, I wanted to do two from Ireland in order to fairly represent it, and one that is a bit different than traditional Irish. Now, traditionally, both Ireland and Scotland did peated whiskies, but once coal was distributed, they could use another fuel source. So peated whiskies became more associated with, particularly with Islay and Scotland, but peated whiskies are on the rise in Ireland, and this is one of them. Now, this is one that I wasn't super thrilled with when I first opened it and first reviewed it. It needed some aeration. Aeration does two things. One, it helps open it up. Some hidden aromas and flavors are going to show themselves. Also, it helps a whiskey become, say, more integrated. If components are sort of here and there spread apart, it'll help harmonize them and bring them together. So I'm more and more impressed with this one as it gets more aeration. But before I get into this, here are my notes. Teeling Black Pit's Irish Single Malt Whiskey, made from 100% peated barley, aged in bourbon and Sauternes cask, is unchill filtered, has natural color, it's bottled at 46% alcohol by volume, and sells for about $67 in my neighborhood. So in case you don't know what Sauternes is a botrytized wine from the southern Bordeaux region and Grave, which is south of the Medoc and Het Medoc and all that. And botrytization is actually a mold, Botrytis cinerea, that infects the grapes, extracts moisture, and leaves behind a lot of sugar. So a botrytis wine typically has a lot of honey notes and a lot of orange notes, so they're super, 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 super sweet. So when I first tried this, mostly what I was getting was the Sauternes character, that very sweet note. And the peat seemed very subtle. And if you look at the bottle, it's black and black pitch. You're expecting something really dark, something maybe like, I don't know, like something from Ardbeg or something from Lefroy or an Octomore. You're thinking something real, real dark. And the peat character was so light, it really wasn't meeting, I thought, what was the labeling. However, as it's opened up, the peat character is really showing itself more and more. In fact, now I think it's really, and I have it down to about here, it really showing its fullest, and it's really well balanced. So I do get the sort of peach, pineapple, honey, a little bit of orange, but wafting through that is some nice smoke character and a hint of spice on the palate. The sweetness of the Sauternes cask and the smoke and the peat are really blended together really, really, really well. It's a little thin, but it has a nice development. You don't get peat and then sweetness or sweetness and then peat. They're really intermingled really, really, really well. And so we get almost like a smoked pineapple, smoked orange, a smoked tropical fruit character all the way through. It does stay fairly sweet. But the earthiness and the smoke of the peat is really a nice counterbalance to that sweetness, and then you get a little bit of spice on the background. I think Sauternes cask and peated whiskeys is a bit of a challenge. These two are going to be in competition with each other. I think a bourbon cask works best, although I also like peated sherry cask whiskeys. But after it has some aeration, these work together really, really, really well. What would I give it in terms of score? I'm going to go a solid 89 points. And our next stop is Scotland. So I'm going to do two whiskeys from Scotland, and to tell you the truth, really hard to pick just two whiskeys. There are so many that I absolutely love from Scotland, but I thought, I want to find one that's affordable, that's attainable, that is generally available, not too crazy on the price, and yet just absolutely knocks it out of the park. So I had to go with, first, the Glen Turret 12-year-old. Now these are vintage bottlings, so there can be some variation from year to year. This is the 2021 release, so probably got a 2024 release. How consistent are they from bottle to bottle? I don't know. But I also have a 2010 from 2021, and it's absolutely superb as well. So I've been to Scotland thus far 4 times and have been to 49 distilleries. I've not been to Glenturret. It is on my list to visit if I go back for a 5th trip to Scotland. But before I give you my notes on this one, here's a little bit about the whiskey. The Glenturret 12-year-old single malt Scotch whiskey, aged in American oak, that is ex-bourbon cask, European oak, that is ex-sherry cask, bought at 46% alcohol by volume, and sells for around $84 in my neighborhood. So sort of like the Powers John Lane, it's an even 50-50 blend of bourbon cask and sherry cask. This one comes across as more malty because it's not triple distilled. It's not as that sort of a light and airy character that you might get from a pot still whiskey. It also is not going to be as creamy and smooth as a pot still whiskey. And this one's a little earthier. You get more intense sherry notes. So if you think 50-50 or right down the middle line, I think probably the Powers John Lane is just a tad bit more on the bourbon cask side, whereas the Glenturret is a tad bit more on the sherry cask side. Because you do get some of the, just a hint of the sulfury note, a little more of the savory notes, perhaps a little bit of an umami note. And this one has opened up and developed more as it has received more air. So dried black fruit notes. There is a definite earthy character there. You might think this was peated or would have just a hint of peat, but that's probably coming from the sherry cask. A lot of spice, cinnamon, nutmeg, a little dried oranges, a little bit of apricot, slight vanilla note, Christmas cake, because everybody says Christmas cake. Particularly at the time I'm recording this, we're heading up into Christmas. On the palate. The whiskey is rich, starts off sweet, goes a little bit towards more of the savory, a little of that umami character towards the middle, and the spice really kicks in. Up front, more citrus, dried oranges, maybe a little dried lemon. In the middle, get a little of that, it's like a brown bread with raisins in it. The dried oranges is still hanging in there. Spice really kicks in. And right now, as I'm talking, I'm still getting a lot of those spicy notes. It's got a nice round mouthfeel. It's got some oomph in the mouth in terms of grab you in flavor, but also in the mouthfeel. The earthy character reminds me a little bit of Glengarry. Also, maybe if you had a toned down peat character from Springbank. Now, Glenturret doesn't get a whole lot of talk. Personally, if all the bottlings are of this character, I think this could give Springbank a run for its money. It's an absolutely beautiful bottle. The bottles are made by Lalique, or the company is owned by Lalique, which makes those really fancy, expensive decanters and those fancy, expensive bottles for Macallan, for the upper echelon of Macallans. But this is your everyday bottles. It's not like some special release. This is how all other bottles are now made. Absolutely beautiful bottle. Great as a gift if you're looking for something for a friend or a loved one for the Christmas time. Sweet, savory. It's got a hint of smoke, but not from peat. A little bit of a salty character there. And it's got a nice development, really nice development from front and the middle into the finish. What am I gonna give this in terms of score? I'm gonna go 92 points, 92 points. This is just an absolutely phenomenal whiskey. So my second whiskey from Scotland, I had to go peated. And if you've been following my channel for a while, you know I'm gonna reach for Ardbeg. And out of all the Ardbegs that I reach for the most is the Ardbeg 10-year-old Islay single malt Scotch whiskey. But before I get into this one, let me show you my notes. The Ardbeg 10-year-old Islay single malt Scotch whiskey made from 100% malted barley that was peated at 55 to 65 ppm. It is non-Joe filtered, has natural color. It's bottled at 46% alcohol by volume and now sells for around $55 in my neighborhood. So the price on this has actually come down about 10 bucks in my neighborhood. It used to be around 62, got all the way up to 65, and now it's back down to 55. Don't know the reason why. Hopefully this is going to be a common trend. We're going to see prices come down just a little bit. Now I have a lot of peated whiskeys, but when I want a whiskey that, I don't need to analyze it to death, something I'm already at home with, something I'm already familiar with, something I'm already comfortable with, something I don't have to worry about, it's a bottle that I spent too much money on, I tend to just reach for the Ardbeg 10. This is my 6th or 7th bottle, kind of lost track, and something what's deep down inside that's going to scratch an itch is going to be the Ardbeg 10. So, and this one's down to about right here, which means I'm coming up probably before the end of the year, before the end of 2024, I'm going to be buying another one. So the lemon and lime, there's a mud, there's an ashy, smoky character there, a minor amount of spice, a little bit of vanilla. There's that slight briny seaweed character. Wow, fudge, chocolate, dark chocolate on the palate. Love, love, love this whiskey. Starts off sweet, stays fairly sweet. Lemon and lime up front, a little bit of spice, vanilla, that fudge kicks in about mid-palate. The nice sort of surrounding smoky character that just sort of envelops the fruitiness of the whiskey. I like that it maintains the sweetness and it maintains the more earthy mud-like character as well. So it's a nice balance between those two. It has a real nice development. An absolutely superb whiskey. It's not going to break the bank. I like Ardbeg 10 a lot better than a lot of peated whiskeys that go for over 100 bucks. So the two whiskeys that I tend to recommend from Islay, Southern Islay, I'm going to recommend Ardbeg 10 for peat and bourbon cask. Northern Islay, I'm going to typically recommend the Bunnahabhain 12 for sherry cask and non-peated. So in those two recommendations from Islay, you got a non-peated, you got a peated, you got a bourbon cask, you got a sherry cask, you got a north and a south. And both, one's 46.6 if I recall correctly, and this one's at 46% alcohol by volume. Both widely available and affordable. But because I wanted to have a peated whiskey for my second whiskey from Scotland, went with the Ardbeg 10. Score-wise, I tend to recommend, scores are somewhat relative, 90 to 92 points. I think this is an absolutely superb whiskey, one I will always have on my shelf. And from Scotland, we head over to Kentucky in the United States of America. So even though my entry into whiskey was Scotch, I'm a Macallan 12-year-old, the first distilleries I ever visited were in Kentucky. I visited 6 distilleries in Kentucky about 6 months after I first got into whiskey. And one of the distilleries I visited was Heaven Hill, where I got to try for the first time Elijah Craig, a barrel proof. So Elijah Craig, I think of all, particularly of the off-the-shelf, easy to find bourbons, Elijah Craig tends to be my favorite. I think it's got the combination in the mash bill that I really like in terms of corn, wheat, and the amount of rye. But before I get into this, let me tell you a little bit about the profile. Elijah Craig, small batch Kentucky straight bourbon. It's from Heaven Hill Distillery. It's made with a mash bill of 78% corn, 10% rye, and 12% malted barley. It was aged 8 to 12 years in new oak. It's bottled at 47% alcohol by volume or 94 proof and sells for around $35 in my neighborhood. So This is why so many people are into bourbon, and why as a category in terms of whiskey tubers and all that, bourbon channels tend to do better than Scotch channels. 35 bucks in terms of the quality price ratio. For 35 bucks, Scotch can't get anywhere near this. You're going to go at least twice this to get this quality of a whiskey if you go to Scotland. 35 bucks. This is absolutely superb. Now, it's a classic bourbon character. You get a caramel corn, sort of cooked corn, vanilla. There's just a little bit of a spice coming in from the rye, butterscotch, loads of vanilla. There's a little oakiness going on in there. Some honey, maybe a little bit of like maple syrup, that kind of character on the palate. It's creamy, it's silky, it's got a nice coating mouthfeel, it's really rich. Now, why am I doing just the sort of easy to find off the shelf bottle, you know, this 35 bucks? Because this is one, particularly if you're new to whiskeys, I would say this is a great starter point. And for 35 bucks, I want to do whiskeys in this video that were readily available and really affordable. And out of all the ones that I'm reviewing, this is the most affordable and has that high quality price ratio that I think everybody's going to look for. If you're a Scotch guy and you want to try out bourbons, this is the one I would recommend because of its affordability and availability. I'm still tasting it now. It's got a real nice, rich feel to it. It's got a nice development. It's a little woody. It's a little astringent on the back end, but it is rich. Okay, so you get butterscotch. There's a banana bread, banana pudding kind of character, vanilla, honey, just a hint of pepperiness, some cinnamon, nutmeg, a little bit of clove, you know, nice baking spices. I like the mouthfeel of it. I like the evolution of it, and I like the finish. I really, really like this. Now, if you want to step it up a notch, you want to go a better bang for the buck. For under 100 bucks, you can get the Elijah Craig Barrel Proofs. This is a store pick, which isn't readily available because it's a particular store. They bought a cask, and this is the bottle from it. And this is Elijah Craig. This is the 917. So this is one of the early ones when I first got into whiskey. Still under 100 bucks. 3 different batches per year. The ABV can vary. The general profile can vary. If you want to know more about these Elijah Craig Barrel Proofs, there's a lot of bourbon channels out there that like review every single Elijah Craig Barrel Proof that comes out on release. Bourbon for me is a lesser category for me because I'm obviously a bigger Scotch guy, but I do like bourbon. In fact, there's just times in which, you know what, you get the itch and you just want that bourbon. You want the richness, you want the vanilla, you want that banana bread character to it, and so I'm going to reach for a bourbon. For me, for summertime, I'm more of a bourbon guy in the summer than I am in the winter. In the winter, I like heavy sherry cask scotches because they remind me of like Christmas cake, and heavily peated whiskeys. Summertime, particularly, I'm going to go for an Elijah Craig Barrel Proof. I'm going to put it on a rock. When you put it on a rock, you get a lot more of the vanilla character, which is reminds me a little bit of like a vanilla ice cream. Absolutely fantastic. Now, what would I give this in terms of score? I'll go solid, 87 points. 87 points. These typically, the Elijah Craig Barrel Proofs, I think they're 100 points or more. More ABV, more flavor. That's the way you go with it. Alrighty. So let me know what is your favorite bourbon. It might be Elijah Craig, might be the Barrel Proof, or some other one. Let me know down below. And from Kentucky, we head down to Texas with the Balcones Mirador. So with Ireland, I did an Irish pot still and a single malt. With Scotland, I did 2 single malts, one peated, one unpeated. United States, got to go bourbon. Because bourbon is so American. So I then want to go to a single malt. The Edinburgh Whiskey Academy has this excellent course on American single malts. I did a whole video on that. If you're interested in learning more about American single malts, highly recommend checking out that video and check out the course. American single malts are probably one of the most exciting categories of whiskey, period. There's so much going on now. There's a lot of innovation. There's a lot of variation. There's a lot of different reflections of climate and places and styles and producers' philosophies and how they're approaching a single malt. They're not imitating Scotland, although they are being inspired by Scotland. So they got one foot in the old world, but then they're doing things the American way. And so they have one foot in the old world and one in the new world. And Balcones is one of my favorites. Almost all of their bottles are cask strength. They have one particular bottle that isn't. But so for this video, although I have a whole bunch of Balcones I could recommend, but I want to start off with this one because this one I think is a little unique in terms of the overall profile. So let me tell you about it. The Balcones, a Mirador Texas single malt whiskey, aged 2 to 5 years in second fill cask. It's non-chill filtered, has natural color. It's bottled at 54.8% alcohol by volume. Sells for around $75 in my neighborhood. So the only non-cask strength that I've seen come out of Balcones is the lineage. This is super fruity. This is like, if you take a Glenmorangie and just intensify the orange character of it, the 10-year-old, and then bump up the ABV. This is at 47% alcohol by volume. This is sort of the gateway into Balcones, but all the rest of Balcones are, that I've seen, are cask strength. And they got bought out by Diageo a little while back, so they're getting better distribution. You should be able to find these where you're at, particularly through the large chain stores. So on this one, I'm getting the echo of a sherry cask, dried black fruit notes, raisins, honey, some definitely dried oranges, lemon, and a distinctive maltiness. Almost like an orange sherbet rather than just regular oranges. A little bit of lemon on the palate. It's really sweet. Has a lot of oomph, a lot of power. It has good texture. It has some nice weight to it. It has a nice mouth coating feel. It has a good development. On the palate, I get like orange sherbet, lemon sherbet, because it's very intense and concentrated. You know, sherbet is like fruit and then intensified. Get some vanilla, some lemon, just a hint of spice. And it has a nice creamy mouthfeel even at this ABV. And honestly, about a medium to medium plus length finish. So if you want something that is reminiscent of your sherry cask whiskeys coming out of Scotland that tend to have that 50% bourbon, 50% sherry cask finish, you know, that sort of 50-50 balance is there. That is the general profile of this whiskey, but it is intensified due to the climate they have there. It's heavily concentrated and intensified in flavor. I really, really like this one. Now, the ones that I like the most from Balcones are the ones that you generally can't get out of Texas, like Brujeria and not habaneros. It is, hold on, Hechiceros. I was thinking habaneros. No, that's those chilies, those chilies that people put on Mexican food. Hechiceros, which is, I believe, is a port cask. Absolutely fantastic. So if you ever get down to Texas, look out for some of those harder to find bottles from Balcones. What would I give this in terms of score? I'm gonna go solid 88 points. And from the United States, we head north to Alberta, Canada. And the primary whiskey that I would recommend that you can get here in the United States is going to be the Alberta Premium Cask Strength. This one's at 66% alcohol by volume. They can, depending on the bottling, they can vary, but they're all going to be like 63 to 66, somewhere in that neighborhood. Now, I'm also not a big rye drinker, but in terms of the style, of this style and this kind of whiskey, being a rye whiskey, if you're a rye lover, then this is one you're definitely going to want. But before I get into this, let me tell you a little bit about the profile. Alberta Premium Rye Cask Strength Canadian Whiskey, made from 100% prairie rye. It's a non-age statement, but it was aged for at least 5 years. It was aged in ex-bourbon cask a number 4 char from Jim Beam, ex-Canadian barrels, and is bottled at 66% alcohol by volume and sells for around $75 in my neighborhood. So at first on the nose, it reminds me a little of a bourbon if you're trying it blind, because you get a lot of the cask extraction, you get a lot of the vanilla, you get some of those cask spices. But then the rye kicks in. It's a slight herbal note, a little bit of a root beer or sarsaparilla, sort of a grassy character, some spice, a little bit of like Christmas tree, pine needles, maybe a hint of juniper on the palate. Wow. Obviously, this high ABV, it's got a serious bite to it. Now, in terms of the mouthfeel, because they're also using column still, it doesn't have the thick, viscous character that I would like from it. It does feel rather thin, but it's an intensely flavorful whiskey. It has a nice development and a super long finish. On the front, just as on the nose, get a lot of the barrel notes, vanilla, baking spices. Then about midway through, get a little bit of citrus, get some pine, some little bit of Christmas tree, a little bit of juniper. There's a sort of an herbal character going on there. Get the root beer and sarsaparilla. And then what it finishes with is hints of pepper, some herbal notes, and a little bit of spice. I could see where you're in the mood for something that is just intensely spicy, and this is going to be what you're going to reach for. I think it's an absolutely superb whiskey. I think if you're going to study whiskey, you're going to be a student of whiskey, a good Canadian rye is a must-have on your shelf. And if you like this profile of whiskey, this is one I'm going to say you're going to run out and want to grab. Of course, it got a huge write-up in Jim Murray's book a few years ago as the whiskey of the year. But forget that. This is an absolutely superb whiskey. Highly recommend it. I want to give it in terms of a score. Again, because I don't have a huge rye history and background, I got to go just based on preferences, in terms of the intensity of flavor, the development, and length of finish. I'm going to go with 92 points. And from Canada, we head over to Japan. So if you want to check out Japanese whiskeys, I'm going to recommend the Hibiki Harmony. Generally affordable, widely available. I think the 12-year-old is now available. This is the non-age statement. But before I get into this, let me tell you a little bit about it. The Hibiki Harmony Japanese whiskey. This is a blended Japanese whiskey made from malt whiskey, grain whiskey from Suntory's Chita Distillery. It's bottled at 43% alcohol by volume and sells for around $75. So long story short on Japanese whiskeys, founded by Masataka Takatsuru, became really, really popular when Jim Murray did a write-up on Japanese whiskeys. However, there was a time period in which people weren't buying Japanese whiskeys. They're primarily marketed towards Japan. The generation of Japanese young people, that's grandpa drink. We're not drinking that. They're drinking something else. So distilleries started closing in Japan. But when Jim Murray had this write-up and they did a TV series on Masataka Takatsuru, suddenly, overnight, Japanese whiskeys is popular. It's in demand worldwide. But the supply wasn't there because the distilleries had closed. So there's been a revival of Japanese whiskeys, new distillers being brought up. But because the definition of Japanese whiskey wasn't regulated, or it's still not legally regulated, although they now have guidelines from within the industry, there was a lot of shenanigans going on in which whiskey is being brought into the country of Japan, being labeled with these nice, beautiful, fancy labels, and being called Japanese whiskeys that wasn't really Japanese whiskey. So things are still changing in the world of Japanese whiskey. If you want to know more about Japanese whiskey, I want to highly recommend Dave Broom's book, The Way of Whiskey. Awesome writer, beautiful pictures. When I read this book, I wanted to just jump on a plane and then head over to Japan and start visiting distilleries. I also want to recommend you check out Kampai Planet. Max from Scotland, but he lives in Japan and he does a lot of reviews on Japanese whiskeys and talks about some other Japanese beverages. His editing is great. The whole presentation, I think in terms of the video content and the way he presents, is probably one of the best. But because Japanese whiskey is not super popular and it's very, very niche, it's a niche within a niche of whiskey, he didn't get the attention that he deserves in terms of the quality of output he puts out on the channel. So I want to highly recommend that. So I like the elegance and finesse of Japanese whiskey. When I was studying Japanese whiskey a while back, I wanted to do more than just try some whiskeys. I want to get a little bit more into the culture. So I would listen to Japanese music. We have a number of Japanese gardens around here in the San Francisco Bay Area. And so I'd go visit them and I'd take pictures of Japanese whiskey bottles in the gardens. But Japanese architecture, Japanese music, the Japanese calligraphy, the Japanese labels and the bottles, it all kind of goes together. It's a reflective of the Japanese culture. So even if they are bringing in whiskey from Scotland and blending it with Japanese whiskey and so forth, there's still a distinctive, I think, artisanry and craftsmanship in the way in which they blend whiskeys. Now, this one, low ABV, it is a blend of grain and malt whiskey. Very, very approachable. Get honey, get a nice floral note, a little bit of lemon, a little bit of orange, just a hint of spice and some vanilla notes on the palate. It's light, it's delicate, it has some finesse, not overly complicated, particularly after drinking some American bourbons or some other whiskeys. This is something I would start with, not end with, if you're doing a lineup. But it's a beautiful whiskey. I would not add any water to it. I would just drink this as is. Now I have another bottle over here. This was like a 30th anniversary. I was able to pick one up for like 65 bucks. Yeah, and that sounds crazy if you pay attention to prices. For like 65 bucks, someone bought it off me after I opened it and had already reviewed it, and then I was able to get another one for under 100 bucks. These are now going for like over $1,000, which is absolutely bonkers. I wouldn't spend that much for it. But if you happen to see anything like this, particularly some of the big chain stores like Costco, whatever, and usually there's someone standing there and they'll only let you buy one, I highly recommend that you buy one. Now, the contents of the bottle isn't any different than what's in here. Basically, you're buying a super beautiful bottle. But if you can get them for under 100 bucks, and I'm not into flipping, but if you wanted to buy them and flip them, you could do that as well. So, Japanese whiskeys, I'm looking more to get into them. The Hakushu 12-year-old, which is peated, is really, really nice. If there's a Japanese whiskey that you really like, let me know it down below. Now, what do I give this in terms of score? I'm going to go solid like 86 points. And from Japan, we head over to Australia. So a whiskey that I really like from Australia is Lark Distillery out of Tasmania, but they are really difficult to come by. I had 2 bottles of Lark that were sent to me by one of my viewers, and I actually gave it to me in person when we met up. I believe it was it in Kansas or down in Texas? I think it was in Kansas. Anyway, highly recommend Lark if you can get them. I can't find them in my neighborhood, but he picked it up at a shop in Chicago, if I recall correctly. So an Australian that you can find is Starward. This is the Starward Nova. I'll tell you a little bit about it, and then I'll review the whiskey. The Starward Nova Australia Single Malt Whiskey is aged in red wine barrels for 2 years. It's bottled at 41% alcohol by volume and sells for around $48. So Australia, big wines, particularly known for Syrah, or they call it Shiraz. Shiraz is a Rhone varietal. They call it Shiraz in South Africa, and they call it in Australia. That's my poor attempt to do an Australian accent. Cheese, mate. So the wine cask is really showing its influence. It's got a lot of red wine notes, cherries and strawberries, a hint of orange, a little bit of spice. So if you want to check out Australian wines, check out Penfolds. And if you can get a Penfolds Grange, which are like 600 bucks, absolutely stunning, spectacular, powerful wines. Australia obviously has a very intense climate. So when you're looking at the reflection of a climate in a whiskey, you look at Texas, you look at Kentucky, you look at India, and you look at Australia. And, you know, Huge diurnal range, very intense, so the maturation isn't really long. Higher angel share. And with so many wines coming out of Australia, readily available of wine casks, why not put them to good use? This smells a little bit like a melted popsicle, like a fruity popsicle. I don't get any of the malt character in terms of on the nose. It's just a lot of red and orange and lemon fruits. So cherry, lemons, and oranges. And strawberries, a lot of strawberry. Strawberry compote or strawberry preserves on the palate. One more. So, not the most complex whiskey in the world. It's a candy, a fruity candy popsicle character. Same thing got on the nose, you got on the palate. Strawberry preserves, cherry preserves, a little bit of lemon, a little bit of orange. Fairly light, fairly simple, silky smooth, easy drinking, and goes down really quick. Sort of a short to medium finish, not a real long finish, not a huge range. So it's a good whiskey. It's a tasty whiskey. I'm sure a lot of people like it. I'm not overly impressed with it, but if you don't want something that's a little more simple and super fruity, this is a good one to go with. What was it in terms of score? I got like a solid 84, 85 points, somewhere in that range. But at this price point, it's not gonna break the bank. And from Australia, we head over to India. So there aren't a lot of whiskeys coming out of India and the United States. There's basically like 3 or 4 different brands you can commonly find. The one I want to recommend is going to be Amberroot. So this is a really nice whiskey. It's got 1 foot in Scotland and 1 foot in India. But before I get into this, let me tell you about the profile of this whiskey. The Amberroot Fusion Indian Single Malt Whiskey, made from 25% Scottish peated barley, 75% Indian unpeated barley. It's bottled at 50% alcohol by volume and sells for around $79 in my neighborhood. So India, like Kentucky, like Texas, say like Australia, it's a warmer climate. So they're gonna have a high angel share loss, but you're also gonna get very quickly some intense character and a lot of extraction out of the casks. As you saw there in the notes, it's got peat coming out of Scotland and unpeated coming out of India. There's a lot of, although you're not going to see it so much here in the United States, Indian whiskey, quote unquote, that doesn't really meet the legal standard of whiskey that they generally sell to Indians in India. So in one sense, India is one of the biggest producers and consumers of whiskey, but it isn't the same legal definition that the rest of the world has. So in terms of consuming whiskey outside of their local stuff, then it's not as big. But India is a huge market for whiskey. Right now, they have, or at least last I read, they have a 150% import tax on Scottish whiskey. If they ever do away with the tariffs in India, you're going to hear a loud sucking sound coming out of Scotland into India because they are going to absolutely dry up the market. So they don't want Scotland and Ireland and so forth, or the United States bourbons to compete with local Indian-made whiskey that are made for the Indian consumer. Hence the high tariffs and taxes on the whiskeys. But should that ever change, we're going to really see a drought in the whiskey market. So now in Fremont, California, which is on the other side of the bay, South Bay from where I live, a high Indian population there. In fact, the Silicon Valley in total has a high Indian population. If you go to a local whiskey shop, or if you go to one of the chain stores and you go to the whiskey section, you can see a lot of people from India in there buying whiskeys because they're going to buy there what they're not going to be able to buy back home. And they're just big fans of whiskey. So in terms of the rest of us, in terms of consumers, they are our competition in terms of buyers. So a lot of the money they're making in the Silicon Valley is going into whiskey. And the local shops, even the chain stores, are smart. They know they need to beef up their, particularly Scotch whiskey section, to appease the thirst of their local Indian consumers. Now, I really like this one because of the climate. It has a lot of intense extraction from the cask, but it's really even killed in terms of the peat and the non-peat character. So it's a moderate peat character. Figs, dates, raisins. It's got sweetness and savory going on the nose. A little bit of fruitiness, some chocolate, a hint of spice. Definitely some fudge on the palate. The chocolate, the fudge, the spice, and the peat are really intertwined really well. You don't get one and then the other. And again, I've got it all the way down here in the bottle, but it was the same even from a neck pour. You can sense the extraction and the intensity just from the climate. They don't have to, this is non-aged, they don't have to age these very long. Kind of like Texas and some parts of Kentucky or in Australia. You don't have to do that in heavy or long-term aging or maturation due to the climate they got there. These are fantastic whiskeys. I think on the flip side, if India made whiskeys, if there were more producers than the few that there are, if they were actually say, you know what, the entire country and all the producers in India are going to change their profile and we're going to start meeting the definition of whiskey that the rest of the world follows, they could be a serious threat on the world market because of the intensity of the climate and the high turnover rate that they could do with their whiskeys. I think this is absolutely fantastic. If you've never had an India whiskey, this is a great place to start, particularly if you like peated Scotch and you have something that's going to be a little bit more affordable and it's widely available. When I give in terms of score, I'm going to go solid 88 points. So these are my 10 recommendations for exploring whiskeys from around the world. If there are some whiskeys that you would like to recommend, maybe even from some other countries that I didn't cover, I covered the top 5 countries plus 2 extras being India and Australia. If there's some others you would like to recommend from these countries or other countries, let me know down below. All right, until next time, Slàinte. Hey, don't forget to subscribe and check out these other whiskey videos.